Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today is Dr. John Walton, who is a professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. Dr. Walton, good to see you here from 1,100 miles away.
Great to be with you again, David.
Some of your podcasts last time were some of the, people just kept flocking to them because they were so great. So I'm hoping that that'll happen this time.
I'm glad they found them helpful.
Yeah, they sure did. They sure did. And your colleagues and some of your students recognized yesterday your contributions to their lives. Tell us a little bit about that.
I hardly know how to talk about it. They honored me by presenting a Festschrift, a collection of articles written in my honor by 23 of my former students and some of them now my colleagues, and including my two sons. So it was
fantastic.
Quite a day and quite an honor.
Well, I knew that was kind of in the planning, but I obviously didn't say anything to you about it because you want to be really surprised when that happens.
And I
right?
was. Even when they told me they had ambushed me for a purpose, I couldn't figure out what they were talking about.
Well, the ambush was worth it, I guess, afterwards,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Good. Well, we're here today to talk a little bit about the fact that context is everything when it comes to doing exegesis, right?
That's absolutely correct.
And in particular, there are four categories that you sent me that we're going to talk about. Now, we can't do them all in one podcast, but we're going to do one in each podcast. But let's talk about those four. What are those four sort of contexts that are everything when you do an exegesis?
Sure. The first one, of course, is the one that this series of podcasts has focused on, and that is the linguistic context. Linguistic context refers to the meanings of the Hebrew or Greek words, the meanings to those who use them, not just what the translations suggest to us.
Right.
And of course, there's often a difference between those two things. Sometimes then the meanings of these words in the linguistic context goes beyond our ability to translate them because we don't always have good English words. So linguistic context is the first. Literary context is the second. That includes things like genre, but also things like rhetorical devices that are used and strategies of literary organization, literary interaction. So literary context is the second. The third is historical context, and that helps us to know how what is taking place in history that the whole audience of the biblical author knows, but that we don't often know, and how that can help us interpret the text better. And then finally, of course, there's cultural context, and that helps us to think about how elements that are embedded in culture are essential for us to understand the full nuances of the biblical text. We often bring our own culture to the text, yet we have to recognize that that can be anachronistic. It can be imposing something foreign on the text. And so we have to try to get beyond our own intuitions based on culture to read the text in its cultural context. So that's the four: linguistic, literary, historical, and cultural.
Well, let's start with linguistic, and you're going to take us to 1 Samuel 13, I think, right?
Yes. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14 is a well-known passage. The idea that God has sought out someone after his own heart has been a treasured, cherished verse for many people. And they've taken it as encouragement that they should be someone who pursues the heart of God. And we often think of that in pietistic, devotional kinds of terms.
Well, but there's a problem with that, right? I mean, I talked to a rabbi one time that said King David violated 9 out of the 10 commandments in his life. I don't know. I've never really counted it that way.
Yeah, he probably didn't keep track either. But of course, that's the contrast.
Right.
When we read the Psalms and think of David in connection with the Psalms, we see that kind of devotional sense. But when
Mm.
you read the narratives of Samuel, particularly, you're shocked at all of the things that David struggled with. And so
Right.
it's very natural to ask the question, how can someone who is pursuing the heart of God actually fall prey to these kinds of problems?
Yeah, and these aren't little sins, little s sins, but big S sins, right?
No, they
Big S
are
sins.
huge
Yeah.
and consistent. And
Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
makes us wonder.
So, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you make sense of it linguistically then,
Mhm.
kind of applying sort of these contextual factors to it?
Yes. Well, linguistically, it means, first of all, we have to understand the meanings of the words that are actually used in the phrase, the Hebrew words. But then we
Okay.
also have to understand how they are used together to communicate something.
Okay.
So we often talk about the collocations that are used. And so we have to look at other places where those connections are used. For this
Okay.
one of the important ones is in Jeremiah 3:15.
Hmm.
Jeremiah is talking to Israel, and he says, talking for the Lord, then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you
Ah.
with knowledge and understanding. And it's the same phrase. And so we find out that this is not talking about so much what David is pursuing in his
Hmm.
devotion, but rather what God is pursuing in his criteria and his choices. That is, that God is using his own criteria to choose a king, in
Hmm.
contrast to Saul, who had been chosen according to the people's criteria, which
Ah,
were
I gotcha.
insufficient.
So there's
Now,
a kind of a narrative connection there.
exactly. So this is important because it says this is not marking David as particularly pious. The text
Hmm.
doesn't tell us what God's criteria are, but it's God's criteria in place. Now there's a little bit footnote to this, and that is from the Assyrian and Babylonian royal inscriptions,
Hmm.
starting 1,000 years before David and going 500 years after David, we find that this is a standard piece of rhetoric. That is, that the kings always claim they have been chosen by the God using the God's criteria, using the same wording. So here's one, Tiglath-Pileser I, beloved prince, your select one, attentive shepherd, whom you chose in the steadfastness of your heart and set him upon the throne. Or Eanetum, nominated by the god Enlil, chosen in the heart by the goddess. Gudea, one after Enlil's heart. This
Ah.
was typical rhetoric that the
This-
god was choosing and putting him on the throne.
So the
So it's
focus here is not that David was such a pious guy, but that
exactly.
God really is doing, God's the one doing the choosing,
Chose him with purpose,
chose him with purpose.
despite his flaws, despite how God knew that he would mess up, how he had messed up in the past, how he would mess up in the future. But God chose him, just as God chose Israel, knowing the problems, just as God chooses each of us, knowing the problems.
That gives me a bit of hope then. Thank you, Dr. Walton, for being a part of this
Sure.
podcast today. Thanks as well to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us edit and produce the podcast. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then the best place you can do that is Wheaton College. They have a great program, great faculty like Dr. Walton here, and wonderful students as well, whether you want to study at the graduate or undergraduate level. Go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages and also the Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.